If someone had told me years ago that I would marry a man capable of hiding dark secrets, I would have laughed. I've always been careful, rational. I was never the type to get swept away by blind passion or impulsive romances. But when I met Ethan, everything was different. He was exactly what I had always wanted: charismatic, attentive, protective. He wasn't just handsome, he had that way of knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. He made me feel safe, loved. In the beginning, our relationship felt like something out of a romantic movie. He took me on spontaneous dinner dates, left me sweet little notes, and whenever I needed something, he was always one step ahead. It was as if he knew exactly how to win me over. "You're the love of my life, Claire." He said it with such certainty that it was impossible not to believe him. Our friends and family praised our relationship. I often heard things like, "You found an amazing man," or "He's a true gentleman." And deep down, I thought so too. But at the same time, there was always something about him that I could never fully understand. Sometimes he seemed distant, mysterious, as if a part of him was locked away, unreachable. In the middle of a conversation, he would suddenly look away as if hiding a forbidden thought. Every now and then, I'd catch him lost in his own mind, staring into nothing with a tense expression. But whenever I asked what was wrong, he would always smile and say, "Nothing, my love, just work." And I believed him, because I wanted to believe him. We got married in a simple yet beautiful ceremony. He seemed genuinely happy. I certainly was. At that moment, I could never have imagined that years later, my world would fall apart in a way I would never forget. The man I had shared my life with was not who I thought he was. They say love can blind us, and looking back, I see that's exactly what happened to me. At first, the signs were subtle, almost imperceptible. Little things that on their own didn't seem alarming. But together, they formed a disturbing pattern that took me too long to see. It started with the phone calls. Ethan had always received a lot of calls, but over time, something changed. He only answered when he was away from me. If his phone rang while we were in the same room, he would step out to take it. And when he came back, his expression would be different. Sometimes tense, other times avoiding eye contact. And if I asked who it was, his answer was always vague. "Just work, love." Sometimes he hung up too quickly. Other times he answered but didn't speak for a few seconds, as if he were listening intently. It was strange. Another thing that bothered me was his sudden disappearances. In the first few months of our marriage, he was predictable. He came home at the same time, we watched TV together, cooked on weekends, but suddenly he started leaving without warning. "I just need to take care of something, I won't be long," he would say. And I believed him. Until those disappearances became more frequent. Sometimes he left late at night, other times early in the morning before I even woke up. I asked him a few times what was going on, but he always had a ready excuse. "I'm helping a friend. It's just something for work." "Nothing serious, love. No need to worry." And I tried not to worry. After all, he had never given me a real reason to doubt him. Or had he? One night, I woke up in the middle of the night and realized Ethan wasn't in bed. I got up and found our bedroom dark, except for a faint light coming from the hallway. The office door was slightly open, and he was inside, whispering into the phone. My heartbeat quickened. I stood there, frozen, catching only fragments of his conversation. "Not now. Too risky. We need to wait. People are watching." My heart pounded in my chest. What was he hiding? Before I could hear more, he suddenly hung up and went silent. I rushed back to bed and shut my eyes, trying to look asleep. My heart was beating so hard, I was afraid he would hear it. A few minutes later, Ethan came back to bed. He wrapped his arm around me as if nothing had happened. I should have asked him. I should have pressed for answers. But I didn't want to believe something was wrong. So I ignored it. I ignored the strange phone calls. I ignored the sudden disappearances. I ignored the uneasy feeling that there was a part of Ethan's life I would never know. I convinced myself it was all in my head. Until the day the police knocked on our door. It was a normal morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard loud knocks at the door. It wasn't a regular knock. It was urgent. My heart jumped. I set the coffee pot aside and walked to the door, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe a delivery driver. But when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Two uniformed police officers stood there, staring at me with serious expressions. For a second, everything around me went silent. "Mrs. Claire Sullivan?" one of them asked in a firm voice. My mouth went dry. I nodded, confused. That's when I saw Ethan coming down the stairs, wearing an expression I would never forget. His face turned pale, his eyes widened. He knew. He already knew why they were here. One of the officers turned to him and said something that made my blood run cold. "Ethan Sullivan, you're under arrest." My world stopped. "What?" My voice came out choked. I looked at Ethan, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a mistake, some ridiculous misunderstanding, but he said nothing. The officers stepped inside without hesitation, one of them beginning to read Ethan his rights. I only caught bits and pieces: suspect, investigation, evidence. Ethan slowly raised his hands, not resisting. He didn't even look surprised. And that's when a terrible thought took over my mind. My husband wasn't innocent. I felt dizzy, like my own body was failing me. I gripped the wall to keep myself from collapsing. Everything was falling apart. "This must be a mistake," I shouted, my voice shaking. One of the officers gave me a look filled with sympathy, but simply said, "We need to take him in, ma'am." Ethan finally broke his silence. He turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't fear. It was resignation. "Claire," he started, but then stopped. There was nothing left to say. Right there in front of me, they put him in handcuffs. My husband. The man I had built a life with. As they led him outside, I saw some of our neighbors watching, whispering, pointing. My face burned with shame and confusion. "You can come to the station, ma'am. You'll be able to understand more there," one of the officers told me. I just nodded, unsure if I even wanted to hear the truth, because deep down, I already felt it. The man I shared my bed with every night was not who I thought he was, and from that moment on, my life would never be the same. I arrived at the police station in a state of shock. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Ethan's name echoed through the hallways. Officers moved back and forth. Documents were being signed. Firm voices issued orders. Everything felt surreal. I kept hoping, desperately, that someone would tell me this was all a mistake, that my husband was innocent. But when the detective walked into the room where I was waiting, the serious look on his face told me that the truth was far worse than I had imagined. He sat across from me and, without hesitation, began to speak. "Mrs. Sullivan, I know this must be a shock for you. But your husband has been involved in criminal activities for years. We've been investigating him for months, and we finally have enough evidence to arrest him." I shook my head in denial. "No, that can't be right. Ethan has never done anything wrong." My voice cracked, almost childlike. I sounded like a kid trying to convince herself the monster under the bed wasn't real. The detective let out a sigh and slid a folder toward me. "You need to see this." With trembling hands, I opened the folder, and it felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. Photos. So many photos of Ethan, but not the Ethan I knew. He was in dark alleys, talking to men whose faces I had only seen in crime reports. In one picture, he was holding an envelope stuffed with cash. In another, he was using a payphone, glancing over his shoulder as if he knew he was being watched. "Your husband was part of an information trafficking ring. He infiltrated companies to steal sensitive data and sell it on the black market. Documents, bank passwords, confidential records. He manipulated people and made it all look like legitimate work." I covered my mouth with both hands. This was a nightmare. No, my voice came out as a whisper. There's more. The detective flipped through the pages and showed me a report. Your husband didn't just steal information. He blackmailed people to eliminate any threats. Some of his victims disappeared shortly after confronting him. A knot tightened in my stomach. What are you saying? That he hurt people? The detective hesitated for a second. But then he spoke the words that made my breath catch in my throat. We believe your husband was responsible for at least 2 deaths. That was the moment my world shattered into a million pieces. I thought about all. The nights Ethan came home late, the way he avoided eye contact, the strange phone calls, how he never talked about work. I had married a killer. Tears streamed down my face. My whole body shook. It was like I was trapped in a horror movie. But I was the main character. The detective watched me for a moment before asking, his voice softer now. Did you know anything, Claire? I lifted my gaze, feeling a rage and pain I had never felt before. No, I never knew anything. But now everything makes sense. And for the first time, I realized the man I had shared my life with had never really existed. I left the police station in a state of shock. The world seemed to spin around me, but I stood still, trapped in a reality that refused to make sense. My husband was a criminal, a murderer. The person I had spent years of my life with wasn't real. Ethan was a lie. When I got into my car, my fingers trembled so much that I could barely get the key into the ignition. The truth echoed in my mind, hammering like a sentence I could never erase. I had loved a man who didn't exist. In the days that followed, my life became a nightmare. News outlets plastered his face everywhere. Reporters showed up outside my house demanding statements. Neighbors who once smiled at me now looked at me with suspicion. Some believed I had known all along. But the worst part came when I was called to testify. I sat before the prosecutor and investigators, feeling the weight of every gaze on me. I had to recount everything, every detail, every suspicion I had ignored. Every night he had disappeared without an explanation. With each answer I gave, one thing became painfully clear. I wasn't just deceived. I had been manipulated. Ethan knew exactly how to hide the truth. He loved me the way a predator loves its bait. I was his cover, his mask of normalcy, the perfect wife for the perfect man, who, deep down, was a monster. Months later, the day of the trial arrived. I sat in the courtroom, my heart heavy as I listened to each charge being read. And then, he walked in. Ethan. Even in handcuffs, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit, he didn't look shaken. There was no fear in his eyes, just a chilling coldness that made me realize, at that moment, I had never truly known him. He looked straight at me and smiled. A cold shiver ran down my spine. How could he smile? How could he look at me like that after everything? I clenched my fists. I could feel the pain, the humiliation, the rage, boiling inside me. But in that instant, something shifted. I realized I was no longer his prisoner. He could stare at me all he wanted, as if he still had control. But he didn't. Not anymore. Not ever again. The judge read the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ethan didn't react. He simply lowered his head, as if finally accepting his fate. And that was when I felt truly free. In the months that followed, I started over. I sold the house we had shared, changed my phone number, cut ties with everything that connected me to him. I rebuilt my life from scratch. The trauma still lingered. Some nights I woke up breathless, reliving those moments. But over time, I learned to cope. I learned that I wasn't stupid or naive. I had been deceived by a master manipulator. And most importantly, I learned that the worst kind of prison isn't made of steel bars. It's made of lies. But now I was free. Ethan was exactly where he had always belonged, behind bars. And me? I finally had my life back.